The candles in the great hall had barely been lit when Evelina Ashworth heard the whispers turn into gasps. She stood at the top of the marble staircase in her wedding gown, her hand resting on the polished rail, when Duke Alastair Ravensmore walked into the hall with Miss Cordelia Whitmore at his side. Evelina's heart dropped before a single word was spoken. She knew that walk, she knew that proud tilt of his chin, and she knew in that instant that something had gone terribly wrong. "Alastair," she said, forcing her voice to stay calm as she came down the stairs. "The guests are already arriving. Why are you not dressed for the ceremony?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced at Cordelia, who stood beside him in a gown far too fine for a simple visit. Her chin lifted with a confidence that made Evelina's stomach tighten. "Evelina," Alastair finally said, his voice steady but cold, "I cannot marry you today." The words landed like a blow. For a moment, Evelina thought she had misheard him. 5 years. 5 years of waiting, of nursing him back to health when fever nearly took his life, of managing his estate's books while he traveled, of turning away every other suitor because her heart and her word belonged to him alone. 5 years, and now, on the very morning of their wedding, he stood before her with another woman at his side. "What do you mean you cannot marry me?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed. Alastair straightened his shoulders as though gathering courage from some hidden place. "I am to marry Miss Whitmore instead. The arrangements have already been made. I am sorry, Evelina, but this is how it must be." A murmur rippled through the guests who had begun filling the hall, dressed in their finest silks and jewels, expecting a joyous wedding. Instead, they witnessed the public unraveling of a promise 5 years in the making. Evelina felt every eye turn toward her, felt the heat rise to her face, felt the humiliation settle over her like a heavy cloak she could not remove. 5 years, she whispered, more to herself than to him. 5 years, Alastair, and you tell me this now. In front of everyone. "I did not plan for it to happen this way," he said, though his tone lacked any real regret. "But my estate is in ruin. You know this. The debts my father left behind cannot be paid with promises and patience alone. Miss Whitmore's family has offered a solution I cannot refuse." Cordelia Whitmore said nothing, but the small, satisfied smile at the corner of her lips told Evelina everything she needed to know. This was no accident, no sudden change of heart. This had been planned, perhaps for weeks, while Evelina continued to prepare for a wedding that was never meant to happen. Evelina looked around the hall at the guests who had once smiled warmly at her, who had praised her devotion and patience, and now stared at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. She had imagined this day so many times, walking toward Alastair with joy in her heart. She had never imagined standing here, exposed and humiliated, while he chose another woman over her in front of everyone she knew. She thought of her father, who had passed 3 years earlier, and how he had trusted Alastair with his daughter's future. She thought of the nights she had spent by Alastair's bedside during his illness, praying he would recover, never once considering that her devotion might mean nothing to him in the end. "You could have told me privately," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper now. "You could have spared me this." "I thought it best to be honest before witnesses," Alastair replied, though the excuse rang hollow even to his own ears. "So there would be no confusion about my intentions." Evelina realized then that he had not chosen this moment out of honesty, but out of convenience. A private conversation might have allowed her to argue, to plead, to change his mind. A public declaration left her no room to fight back without further embarrassing herself. He had chosen his own comfort over her dignity, just as he was choosing Cordelia's fortune over her loyalty. She lifted her chin, refusing to let the tears building in her eyes fall in front of the crowd. "Then I wish you well, Your Grace," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I hope Miss Whitmore's fortune brings you everything you desire." The words carried a quiet sharpness that made Alastair flinch, though he tried not to show it. Cordelia's smile faltered slightly, perhaps sensing that Evelina's calm was more dangerous than tears would have been. Evelina turned to the gathered guests, many of whom looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "There will be no wedding today," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. "I am certain the Duke will explain the details to anyone who wishes to know them." With that, she walked past Alistair and Cordelia without another glance, her wedding gown trailing behind her like the remnants of a life she would never have. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she forced herself to keep walking, to keep her back straight, to give the watching crowd nothing more to whisper about. Once she reached her chamber, she closed the door and finally allowed herself to breathe. Her hands shook as she reached for the pins holding her veil in place, removing them one by one until the delicate lace fell to the floor. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. Her eyes were red, her face pale, but there was something else in her expression too, something that had not been there before. A quiet, burning resolve. Margaret Fenwick, her longtime companion and closest friend, entered the room without knocking, her face full of concern. "Evelina, I came as soon as I heard. Is it true? Has he truly broken the engagement?" "It is true," Evelina said, her voice flat. "He has chosen Miss Whitmore." "Her fortune, more precisely." Margaret's hands flew to her mouth. "How could he do such a thing, and on your wedding day, after everything you have done for him?" "He did it because he could," Evelina replied, sitting down at her dressing table. "Because he believed I would simply accept it, as I have accepted everything else these past 5 years." "And will you," Margaret asked carefully, "accept it, I mean?" Evelina was quiet for a long moment, staring at her reflection. "I have no choice but to accept that it happened, but I do not have to accept what it means for the rest of my life. I will not spend my days pitied by the same people who once envied my engagement to a duke." Margaret sat beside her, taking her hand gently. "What will you do?" "I do not know yet," Evelina admitted. "But I know I cannot stay here. Not in this house, not in this city, not among people who will look at me and remember this day every time they see my face." Outside, the sound of carriages departing echoed through the courtyard as the guests, no doubt eager to spread the scandal to every corner of society, left the estate in a hurry. By nightfall, Evelina knew, the story would have already reached every drawing room in London. She would be the woman the Duke abandoned, the bride left standing at the altar, the fool who wasted 5 years on a man who never truly valued her. She thought of her father again, of the modest but proud life he had built before his passing, and of the small cottage he had once owned near the southern coast, left to her in his will but never used since his death. It had seemed too far, too quiet, too removed from the life she had been building with Alistair. Now, it seemed like the only place in the world where she might find peace. "I will leave London," she said finally, the decision settling into place as she spoke the words aloud. "I will go to my father's cottage by the sea. There, at least, no one will know my name or my humiliation." Margaret squeezed her hand. "I will come with you if you will have me. I have no wish to remain in a city that has treated you so unkindly." Evelina managed a small, grateful smile, the first genuine expression to cross her face since Alistair had spoken his cruel words. "Thank you, Margaret. I do not know what I would do without you." As the sun began to set over the estate that had once been meant to become her home, Evelina Ashworth packed away her wedding gown, folding it carefully into a trunk she never intended to open again. She would leave this life behind, along with the man who had broken his promise so easily, and the woman who had taken her place without a hint of shame. She did not yet know what waited for her beyond the walls of London, in the quiet cottage by the sea. She did not know that the very humiliation she suffered that day would become the foundation of a strength she never knew she possessed. But as she looked out the window one final time, watching the last of the wedding guests disappear down the long drive, she felt something shift within her, a quiet determination taking root where heartbreak had been. She would not beg, she would not weep in public again, she would not allow Alistair Ravensmore or Cordelia Whitmore to see her broken. Instead, she would rebuild, quietly, carefully, and completely on her own terms. And though she could not have known it then, the woman leaving that grand estate in disgrace would one day return to a very different world, one where the Duke who had cast her aside would find himself looking up at everything she had become. The journey south took 3 days, and with every mile that passed, Evelina Ashworth felt the noise of London fade further behind her. She sat beside Margaret Fenwick in the carriage, watching the crowded streets give way to open fields, then rolling hills, and finally the rugged cliffs that marked the edge of the sea. She had not spoken much since leaving the estate. There was little left to say that Margaret did not already understand. When the carriage finally rolled to a stop outside a small stone cottage overlooking the water, Evelina stepped down and stood still for a long moment, simply looking at the place her father had left her. It was nothing like the grand halls of the Ravensmore estate. The roof needed repair, the garden had grown wild with neglect, and the paint on the shutters had faded from years of salt air. And yet, standing there with the wind pulling at her hair and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below, Evelina felt something she had not felt in a very long time: relief. "It is smaller than I remembered," she said quietly, pushing open the creaking gate. "It is honest," Margaret replied, following close behind. "No false promises here. Just walls and a roof and time to think." Inside, dust covered every surface, and the air smelled of years spent empty. Evelina walked from room to room, running her fingers along the worn wooden furniture her father had once used, remembering the summer she had spent here as a child before her mother's passing had changed everything. She remembered her father teaching her to read ledgers at the kitchen table, insisting that a woman should understand numbers as well as any man, no matter what society expected of her. She had not thought of those lessons in years. Now, they felt like the only inheritance that truly mattered. The first weeks were difficult. Word of the broken engagement had not yet reached this quiet corner of the coast, and for that, Evelina was grateful. She spent her days clearing the garden, repairing what she could of the cottage with the help of a local carpenter named Simon Fairweather, and slowly adjusting to a life without servants, without titles, and without the constant presence of a man she had once believed she would spend her life beside. Simon proved to be a steady, quiet presence during those early days. He said little, but what he did say was always useful and honest. He fixed the roof without complaint, repaired the garden fence, and never once asked about the life she had left behind in London. Evelina appreciated his discretion more than she could express. "You handle a hammer better than most gentlemen I have known," she remarked one afternoon, watching him work on the cottage's front door. Simon smiled, a rare expression from a man who rarely wasted words. "A hammer does not care whether you were born a lady or a laborer, Miss Ashworth. It only cares whether you know how to use it properly." "A sensible philosophy," Evelina said, and found herself smiling for what felt like the first time in weeks. As the cottage slowly transformed from a neglected shell into a modest but comfortable home, Evelina began to take notice of the town nearby, a small but bustling port community that relied heavily on its textile mill for employment and income. The mill, she learned from the local shopkeepers, had once been prosperous under its previous owner, but had fallen into disrepair after his passing, leaving many of the townspeople without steady work. One afternoon, while walking through the town square with Margaret, Evelina overheard two women discussing the mill's troubles. The new owner, a distant relative of the previous one, had little interest in running the business and even less understanding of how to manage it. Workers had not been paid properly in months, and many feared the mill would close entirely, leaving the entire town without its primary source of income. "That poor man inherited a mill and does not even know how a loom works," one woman said, shaking her head. "My husband has not seen a fair wage in 3 months." Evelina found herself unable to stop thinking about the conversation for the rest of the day. She remembered the ledgers her father had taught her to read, the hours she had spent managing Alistair's estate accounts while he traveled, and the natural understanding of numbers and business that had always come easily to her, even when society insisted such matters were better left to men. That evening, she mentioned the mill to Margaret over a simple dinner of bread and soup. "It seems a shame," she said, "that a business could fail simply because its owner lacks the knowledge or the will to manage it properly." "You sound as though you have an idea," Margaret said, raising an eyebrow. "Perhaps I do," Evelina admitted. "I have spent years managing accounts and estates for other people." Why should I not attempt to do the same for myself, for once? Margaret set down her spoon, studying her friend carefully. You mean to involve yourself in trade, a woman running a business? Women have run households far larger and more complicated than any mill, Evelina replied. I do not see why the principles should be so different. The following week, Evelina visited the mill herself, dressed plainly to avoid drawing attention. She found the building in a state of quiet decline, machines sitting idle, workers standing in small groups with worried expressions, and the current owner, a nervous young man named Thomas Whitfield, clearly overwhelmed by responsibilities he had never wanted nor understood. I did not ask for this mill, he admitted to her, after she introduced herself simply as a local resident interested in the town's affairs. My uncle left it to me in his will, but I know nothing of textiles or trade. I only wish to be rid of it before it ruins me financially. Evelina studied the mill carefully, noting the outdated equipment alongside several machines that appeared to be in reasonably good condition, simply neglected rather than truly broken. She noted the workers' skill, evident even in their idle hands, and the quality of the fabric samples still hanging near the entrance, clearly the product of experienced hands rather than poor craftsmanship. Would you consider selling the mill, she asked carefully, to someone who might be willing to invest the time and resources needed to restore it properly? Thomas Whitfield's eyes widened with obvious relief. You know someone interested in such an investment. I might be persuaded to consider it myself, Evelina said, surprising herself with the confidence in her own voice. Over the following weeks, Evelina used the small amount of money remaining from the sale of her jewelry, along with careful negotiations with Thomas Whitfield, to purchase a majority stake in the struggling mill. It was not a large sum by London standards, but it was enough to begin. Margaret worried openly about the risk, reminding Evelina how quickly their remaining funds could disappear if the venture failed. We have little left to lose, Evelina reminded her gently. And I would rather lose what remains attempting something meaningful than watch it slowly disappear while I sit idle, waiting for a life that will never return to me. The early days of managing the mill tested every ounce of patience and determination Evelina possessed. She spent long hours reviewing outdated records, meeting with workers to understand their concerns, and researching the current state of the textile trade through correspondence with merchants in nearby towns. She discovered quickly that many of the mill's problems stemmed not from a lack of skill among its workers, but from years of poor management and neglected equipment. She hired Simon Fairweather, whose skills extended well beyond carpentry, to help repair and maintain the machinery. She spoke directly with the workers, many of whom had assumed they would simply be dismissed once the mill inevitably closed, and assured them that she intended to restore the business rather than abandon it. I cannot promise success, she told them honestly during her first meeting with the mill's employees. But I can promise that I will work as hard as any of you to see this place thrive again, and I will treat you fairly, with wages paid on time and conditions that respect your skill and effort. The workers, skeptical at first of a woman claiming ownership over their livelihoods, slowly began to trust her as she kept her promises, week after week. Wages were paid consistently. Broken equipment was repaired rather than ignored. Evelina listened to their suggestions about improving efficiency, incorporating their practical knowledge into her own understanding of the business. Word of the mill's slow recovery began to spread through the town, and with it came a quiet respect for the woman responsible for the change. Few knew her full history, only that she had arrived from London under circumstances no one fully understood, and had proven herself capable of far more than anyone expected. Margaret, watching her friend transform from a heartbroken bride into a determined businesswoman, could not help but marvel at the change. You seem different than you did even a month ago, she observed one evening as they sat together near the fireplace, reviewing the mill's latest accounts. I feel different, Evelina admitted. For the first time since my father passed, I feel as though I am building something that belongs entirely to me, rather than waiting for someone else to decide my future. Despite the mill's early struggles, small signs of progress began to appear. Orders that had once gone to competing mills in nearby towns slowly returned as word spread of the improved quality and reliability of Evelina's operation. The modest profits she earned were carefully reinvested into further improvements, rather than spent on luxuries she no longer desired. Yet even as her new life began to take shape, Evelina could not entirely escape thoughts of the world she had left behind. Occasional letters from acquaintances in London brought news, most of it centered around the surprising marriage of Duke Alastair Ravensmore to the wealthy Miss Cordelia Whitmore, a union that society had initially celebrated as a perfect solution to the Duke's financial troubles. Evelina read these letters with a strange, distant curiosity, as though the events described belonged to another woman's life entirely. She felt no lingering desire to return to that world, no wish to reclaim the position she had lost. Whatever pain remained from Alastair's betrayal had slowly transformed into something else entirely, a quiet fuel that drove her forward rather than a wound that held her back. "Do you ever wonder," Margaret asked one evening, "what might have happened if he had married you instead?" Evelina considered the question carefully before answering. "I used to wonder that constantly in the weeks after we arrived here, but now I find myself grateful in a strange way that he chose as he did. Had he married me, I would still be managing his estate, still waiting for him to notice my efforts, still believing that my worth depended entirely on his approval. Instead, I am here, building something that answers to no one but myself." As autumn settled over the coastal town, bringing cooler winds and shorter days, the mill continued its slow but steady recovery. Evelina began exploring opportunities to expand beyond simple textile production, corresponding with merchants about the possibility of trading finished goods directly rather than relying solely on middlemen who took a significant portion of the profits. She did not yet know how far this new path would take her, nor did she fully understand the extent to which her quiet determination would eventually reshape not only her own fortune, but the fortunes of those who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a discarded bride. But as she walked home each evening along the cliffside path overlooking the sea, watching the sun set over waters that seemed to stretch endlessly toward possibilities she had never before considered, Evelina Ashworth felt, for the first time in years, that her future belonged entirely to her. And somewhere in London, though she did not yet know it, the marriage that had replaced her own was already beginning to crack beneath the weight of expectations neither the Duke nor his new Duchess had ever truly understood. In London, the marriage between Duke Alastair Ravensmore and Cordelia Whitmore had been celebrated as one of the finest matches of the season. Newspapers praised the union as proof that new money and old titles could combine to create something stronger than either alone. Guests at the wedding spoke of little else for weeks, marveling at the elegance of the ceremony, the size of the dowry, and the seemingly perfect pairing of a handsome duke with a beautiful heiress. Only Cordelia herself seemed to sense, even on her wedding day, that something essential was missing from the arrangement. She stood beside Alastair as he greeted their guests, smiling when expected, laughing at appropriate moments, playing the role of a joyful bride with practiced precision. But beneath the surface, she could not ignore the growing unease that had settled in her chest the moment she agreed to marry a man who had broken another woman's heart to secure her fortune. Cordelia had grown up watching her father, Charles Whitmore, build his shipping empire from nothing, expanding a small fleet of merchant vessels into one of the most profitable trading companies in England. She had learned from him the value of careful investment, the importance of understanding exactly what one was purchasing before committing resources to it. And though she had entered this marriage with her eyes wide open, fully aware that Alastair sought her fortune rather than her heart, she had allowed herself to hope, perhaps foolishly, that respect and partnership might eventually grow between them, even if love did not. That hope began to fade within the first month of their marriage. Alastair, freed from the immediate pressure of his estate's crushing debts thanks to Cordelia's dowry, seemed to lose all urgency regarding the future. He spent his days at his clubs, gambling with old friends who had once distanced themselves from him during his financial troubles, but now returned eagerly now that his pockets were full again. He showed little interest in the estate's ongoing management, leaving important decisions to stewards who, Cordelia quickly discovered, were far less competent than they claimed to be. "The tenant farms have not been properly inspected in over a year," Cordelia said one evening, reviewing a stack of documents she had requested from the estate's steward, a nervous man named Percival Grimshaw who seemed perpetually uncomfortable in her presence. "Several of the cottages require repairs that have been ignored for months." Alastair, seated across from her with a glass of brandy in hand, barely glanced up from the newspaper he was reading. "I am certain Grimshaw has matters well in hand, my dear. There is no need to concern yourself with such details." "Someone must concern themselves with such details," Cordelia replied, her patience thinning. "If the tenants cannot properly work their land due to poor housing conditions, the estate's income will continue to suffer, regardless of how much money my father's dowry has provided." Alastair set down his newspaper with a sigh that suggested he found the entire conversation tiresome. "You worry too much, Cordelia. We have money now. Whatever problems remain can be solved simply by spending what is needed." "Money spent without proper planning disappears quickly," Cordelia said, her voice sharper than she intended. "My father did not build his fortune by simply spending whatever problems arose. He built it by understanding exactly where every investment went and ensuring it produced a proper return." "Your father," Alastair replied coolly, "made his fortune in trade, which is a very different matter from managing an estate that has been in my family for generations. I do not require lessons in how to run my own affairs." The conversation ended there, as many of their conversations did during those early months, with Alastair dismissing her concerns and Cordelia retreating into a frustrated silence. She had married a duke, believing perhaps naively that his title came with the same sense of responsibility and diligence her father had always demonstrated in his own business affairs. Instead, she found herself married to a man who viewed her fortune as a solution to his problems rather than a resource requiring careful stewardship. As the months passed, Cordelia began quietly taking matters into her own hands, despite Alastair's dismissiveness. She met privately with Percival Grimshaw, reviewing the estate's accounts herself and identifying areas where money had been wasted through poor management rather than genuine necessity. She authorized repairs to the tenant cottages using her own allowance rather than waiting for Alastair's approval, recognizing that a well-maintained estate ultimately benefited them both, regardless of who received credit for the improvements. Word of her involvement in estate matters eventually reached Alastair through his steward, and rather than expressing gratitude, he responded with irritation. "I understand you have been meeting with Grimshaw regarding estate matters," he said one evening, his tone carrying a clear edge of displeasure. "I would prefer you leave such matters to those responsible for them." "Someone must be responsible for them," Cordelia replied, refusing to back down despite the anger evident in his expression. "You show little interest in the estate's daily operations, and Grimshaw, though well-meaning, lacks the experience necessary to manage such matters properly. Would you prefer the tenants continue suffering simply to preserve your pride?" "My pride has nothing to do with this," Alastair snapped. "You married into this family, Cordelia. You are not required to involve yourself in every detail of its management." "I married into this family expecting a partnership," Cordelia replied, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "Instead, I find myself married to a man who spends his evenings at cards while his estate slowly crumbles around him, and who becomes offended when his wife attempts to prevent that decline." The argument that followed was the first of many similar disagreements that would come to define their marriage over the following months. Alastair, accustomed to a life where his title alone commanded respect and deference, struggled to accept a wife who questioned his decisions rather than simply accepting them. Cordelia, raised by a father who valued competence and results above tradition and titles, found herself increasingly frustrated by a husband who seemed content to let others manage the very responsibilities his position demanded of him. Despite their growing tensions, Cordelia continued her quiet involvement in the estate's affairs, gradually earning the trust and respect of the staff and tenants who had initially viewed her with suspicion. She implemented small but meaningful changes, improving communication between the estate's various departments, ensuring wages were paid promptly, and personally reviewing major expenditures before approving them. Percival Grimshaw, initially uncomfortable with the Duchess's involvement, began to appreciate her careful attention to detail. "Your Grace," he said to her one afternoon, using the title with genuine respect rather than mere formality, "the estate's accounts have shown more improvement in the past 3 months than in the previous 3 years combined." "Thank you, Mr. Grimshaw," Cordelia replied, "though I suspect the improvement has as much to do with your own diligent efforts as with any guidance I have provided. With respect, Your Grace, I have been attempting to properly manage this estate for years, but I lack the authority to make necessary changes without approval from His Grace, who showed little interest in reviewing my proposals. Your involvement has finally allowed those changes to move forward." Cordelia found a strange satisfaction in these small victories, even as her personal relationship with Alistair continued to deteriorate. She had not married for love, understanding from the beginning that Alistair sought her fortune rather than her affection. But she had hoped for mutual respect, for a partnership built on shared purpose even if genuine warmth never developed between them. Instead, she found herself managing an estate largely alone, while her husband treated her efforts as an unwelcome intrusion rather than a valuable contribution. Meanwhile, despite the improvements Cordelia had implemented, the estate's underlying financial troubles proved deeper than anyone had initially realized. Alistair's father had left behind debts far exceeding what had been disclosed during the marriage negotiations, obligations that had been carefully hidden from Charles Whitmore's own investigators during the courtship period. As these hidden debts gradually came to light, Cordelia realized that her substantial dowry, which she had assumed would secure the estate's future for generations, was instead being slowly consumed by obligations that predated her involvement entirely. She confronted Alistair directly upon discovering the full extent of these hidden debts, documents that Grimshaw had reluctantly shown her after much hesitation. "You told my father before our marriage that the estate's debts amounted to a specific figure. This figure," she said, holding up the documents with visible anger, "is nearly triple what you claimed." Alistair's face paled slightly, though he attempted to maintain his composure. "I was not fully aware of the extent of my father's obligations at the time of our courtship. Certain debts were held privately, through arrangements my father never disclosed even to me." "And you did not think to investigate thoroughly before allowing my father to commit such a substantial dowry toward securing this estate's future?" Cordelia demanded. "Did you simply assume the truth would remain hidden indefinitely?" "I assumed," Alistair replied, his voice tightening with obvious discomfort, "that your father's fortune would be more than sufficient to address whatever obligations existed, regardless of their exact figure." Cordelia stared at him, finally understanding the full depth of what her marriage truly represented. She was not a partner in restoring the Ravensmore estate to prosperity. She was a source of funds to be drawn upon indefinitely, regardless of how much her fortune diminished in the process. The realization settled over her like a cold weight, extinguishing whatever small hope remained that their marriage might eventually develop into something resembling genuine partnership. "I see," she said quietly, setting down the documents with careful precision rather than allowing her anger to show further. "Then I suppose I shall simply have to ensure that whatever funds remain are spent wisely, since it appears no one else in this household considers such wisdom a priority." From that point forward, Cordelia's involvement in the estate's management became less a matter of choice and more a matter of necessity. She corresponded regularly with her father's own financial advisors, seeking guidance on how to protect what remained of her dowry while addressing the estate's most pressing obligations. She began quietly setting aside a portion of her personal allowance, a small but growing fund entirely separate from the estate's accounts, understanding instinctively that she might one day need resources that Alistair could not access or control. Charles Whitmore, visiting his daughter several months into her marriage, noticed immediately the strain evident in her expression, despite her attempts to appear content during his visit. "You seem tired, my dear," he observed during a quiet moment away from Alistair's presence. "Marriage does not appear to agree with you as well as I had hoped." "Marriage is proving more complicated than either of us anticipated, Father," Cordelia admitted, allowing herself a rare moment of honesty with the one person who had always understood her most clearly. "Alistair's estate carries debts far beyond what was disclosed during our courtship. I fear my dowry may prove insufficient to secure the future you envisioned for me." Charles Whitmore's expression darkened, though he kept his voice carefully controlled. "Had I known the full extent of his obligations, I would never have agreed to this match, regardless of his title. I trusted his representations, perhaps too readily, believing a duke would not stoop to such deception." "Titles do not guarantee honesty, Father, however much society might wish to believe otherwise," Cordelia replied. "I have learned that lesson perhaps more thoroughly than I would have preferred." "Do you regret the marriage?" her father asked directly, watching her carefully for her reaction. Cordelia considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. "I regret the deception that led to it. Whether I regret the marriage itself remains to be seen, depending entirely on how well I manage to protect what remains of my own future, since it seems unlikely that Alistair intends to do so on my behalf." Charles Whitmore reached out and took his daughter's hand, a rare display of open affection between them. "You have always possessed more sense than most men I have done business with throughout my career. Trust that sense now, Cordelia. Protect yourself, regardless of what society might expect of a duchess." "I intend to, Father," Cordelia replied, her resolve hardening with each passing conversation. "I intend to protect myself very carefully indeed." As autumn turned to winter, the tension within the Ravensmore household continued to grow, with Alistair increasingly resentful of his wife's independence and Cordelia increasingly determined to secure her own financial future regardless of her husband's wishes. Neither of them spoke of the woman whose broken engagement had made their marriage possible in the first place, though her absence from London society had not gone entirely unnoticed among their mutual acquaintances. Occasionally, at social gatherings, someone would mention Evelina Ashworth's name, speculating about her whereabouts since her sudden departure from the city months earlier. Alistair would quickly change the subject on these occasions, clearly uncomfortable with any reminder of the woman he had discarded. Cordelia, however, found herself increasingly curious about the woman whose place she had taken, wondering what had become of someone who had shone, even in the brief moments Cordelia had witnessed during the broken engagement, a quiet dignity that Cordelia herself found difficult not to admire. She could not have known, as she sat alone in the estate's grand but increasingly cold halls, that the very woman she wondered about was, at that same moment, standing in a small textile mill on the southern coast, reviewing profit figures that had exceeded even her own careful expectations. Nor could she have imagined that within a few short years, her own path and Evelina's would cross again under circumstances neither woman could yet foresee. For now, Cordelia simply continued her quiet work, protecting what remained of her fortune while her marriage slowly revealed itself to be exactly the transaction she had always suspected it might become, stripped gradually of whatever illusions she had allowed herself to hold during those first hopeful weeks as a new bride. 2 years passed since Evelina Ashworth first purchased her stake in the small coastal mill, and in that time, the modest operation had transformed into something far more substantial than anyone in the town could have predicted. The looms that once sat idle now ran from early morning until dusk, producing fabric of a quality that had begun attracting attention from merchants well beyond the immediate region. Workers who had once feared losing their livelihoods now took pride in their positions, knowing their wages arrived on time, and their concerns were heard rather than dismissed. Evelina herself had changed considerably during these 2 years, though the transformation had come gradually enough that she rarely noticed it in herself. Where she had once relied entirely on instinct and her father's early lessons in managing accounts, she now possessed genuine expertise in the textile trade, having spent countless hours studying market trends, negotiating with suppliers, and learning the particular challenges of running a business in a world that still viewed women in commerce with considerable suspicion. "You have grown quite formidable," Margaret Fenwick remarked one morning as they reviewed the mill's latest correspondence together. "I remember when you first arrived here, barely able to look at the mill's account books without feeling overwhelmed. Now you speak of profit margins and trade routes as though you were born to it." "Necessity teaches quickly," Evelina replied, though she allowed herself a small smile at the observation. "And I have had excellent teachers, even if most of them did not realize they were teaching me anything at all." The mill's continued success had not gone unnoticed by the town's other merchants, some of whom had initially dismissed Evelina's involvement as a passing curiosity, assuming a woman's interest in trade would fade once the novelty wore thin. Instead, she had proven herself a shrewd and capable businesswoman, one who understood the delicate balance between fair treatment of her workers and the careful management of expenses necessary for sustained profitability. It was during this period of steady growth that Evelina first considered expanding beyond textile production alone. She had noticed, through her correspondence with merchants in nearby port towns, that a significant portion of the mill's potential profits were being lost to middlemen who purchased finished fabric at low prices before reselling it at considerable markup to distant markets. If she could establish her own trade connections, bypassing these intermediaries entirely, the mill's profits might increase substantially. The challenge, of course, lay in establishing such connections without the resources or reputation typically required to enter the shipping trade directly. It was through a chance encounter at the town's harbor that Evelina first met Captain Nathaniel Cross, a weathered sea captain who had spent the better part of 2 decades navigating merchant vessels along the English coast and beyond. She had gone to the harbor that day simply to inquire about shipping rates for a small trial shipment of fabric to a merchant in Bristol, only to find herself drawn into conversation with Captain Cross, who happened to be overseeing the loading of his own vessel nearby. "You run the mill up the hill," he said, more statement than question, studying her with the frank curiosity of a man accustomed to sizing up potential business partners quickly. "I have heard talk of it in the taverns. Good cloth, fair prices, workers who actually speak well of their employer. Unusual combination in this trade, if I am being honest." "I try to run an honest operation, Captain Cross," Evelina replied, "though I confess the mill's profits would benefit considerably from more direct access to distant markets, rather than relying entirely on merchants who take the largest share of every sale." Captain Cross studied her for a long moment before responding. "You are proposing something more ambitious than a simple shipping arrangement, unless I am mistaken." "Perhaps I am," Evelina admitted, "though I have not yet fully determined how such ambitions might be realized, given my current resources." Their conversation that day marked the beginning of a partnership that would prove instrumental to Evelina's future success. Captain Cross, impressed by her clear understanding of trade dynamics and her willingness to take calculated risks, agreed to a modest arrangement wherein he would transport her fabric directly to select merchants in larger port cities, taking a smaller commission than the middlemen who had previously handled such transactions. The arrangement proved immediately profitable, and over the following months, Evelina expanded her direct trading relationships further, corresponding with merchants in London, Bristol, and eventually across the Channel in France, always careful to maintain the quality standards that had first established her mill's reputation. Simon Fairweather, whose role had expanded considerably beyond simple carpentry and equipment repair, proved invaluable during this period of growth, taking on increasing responsibility for the mill's daily operations, while Evelina focused her attention on developing new trade relationships and expanding markets. The new looms have arrived from Manchester, Simon informed her one afternoon, reviewing a shipment manifest with his usual quiet efficiency. More efficient than our current equipment, though it will take the workers some time to adjust to the new methods. Then we shall give them the time they need, Evelina replied. Rushed adjustments lead to mistakes, and mistakes lead to wasted materials and unhappy customers. Better to proceed carefully than to move quickly toward failure. Simon nodded, having long since grown accustomed to Evelina's careful, methodical approach to business decisions. You think differently than most who run such operations, if you do not mind me saying so. Most owners care only for immediate profit, regardless of the long-term consequences for their workers or their reputation. Most owners have not experienced firsthand what it means to be treated as though their worth depends entirely on someone else's convenience, Evelina replied, a hint of her past evident in her tone despite her efforts to keep such matters private. I have learned that treating people fairly, whether workers or customers, ultimately produces better results than treating them as mere tools for personal gain. As the mill's reputation continued to grow, so too did Evelina's standing within the local community. She was no longer viewed simply as a mysterious woman who had arrived from London under unclear circumstances, but as a respected businesswoman whose judgment and fairness had earned genuine admiration among workers, merchants, and townspeople alike. Margaret, watching her friend's steady rise, occasionally reflected on how far they had both come since that humiliating morning in London. "Do you ever think of returning?" she asked one evening as they sat together reviewing the mill's expanding correspondence. "Not to Alastair, of course, but simply to London itself. You could show them all how far you have come." Evelina considered the question carefully before responding. "I have no particular desire to return simply to prove a point to people who never truly valued me in the first place. If my success ever brings me back to London, I would prefer it happen naturally, through business necessity, rather than through any desire for revenge or validation." "That is remarkably gracious of you," Margaret observed, "given everything that happened." "Gracious, perhaps, but also practical," Evelina replied with a small smile. "Bitterness consumes energy far better spent on more productive pursuits. I would rather build something lasting than waste my efforts on satisfaction that fades as quickly as it arrives." It was during this period of expansion that Evelina began exploring opportunities beyond the textile trade entirely, considering investments in related industries that might further strengthen her growing business empire. She corresponded with dye merchants about establishing a more reliable supply chain for the colored fabrics that had become increasingly popular among her customers, and began investigating the possibility of establishing a small warehouse in a nearby port city to facilitate more efficient distribution of her goods. These ambitions required capital beyond what the mill's current profits could easily provide, leading Evelina to cautiously approach the possibility of taking on additional investors for the first time since acquiring her initial stake in the business. She proceeded carefully, mindful of maintaining control over decisions that had proven so successful thus far, seeking investors who shared her values regarding fair treatment of workers and sustainable, long-term growth, rather than simply maximizing immediate profits. Lord Edmund Barrow, a minor nobleman with considerable interest in emerging trade opportunities, but limited patience for traditional aristocratic pursuits, proved an unexpected but valuable connection during this period. Introduced to Evelina through Captain Cross's extensive network of business contacts, Lord Barrow possessed both the capital and the genuine business acumen necessary to become a productive silent partner in her expanding operations. "I confess I was skeptical when Cross first mentioned a woman running such a successful textile operation," Lord Barrow admitted during their initial meeting, his tone carrying more genuine curiosity than the condescension Evelina had grown accustomed to encountering from men of his station. "I have since reviewed your accounts and correspondence, however, and I find myself considerably impressed by what you have accomplished in such a short time." "I appreciate your honesty, Lord Barrow," Evelina replied. though I hope any partnership between us would be based on mutual respect and shared vision, rather than simple curiosity regarding an unusual business arrangement. You need not worry on that account, Lord Barrow assured her. I have little patience for arrangements built on anything other than genuine competence and fair dealing. Your success thus far suggests you possess both qualities in considerable measure. Their subsequent partnership, carefully structured to ensure Evelina retained primary control over the mill's operations, while benefiting from Lord Barrow's additional capital and broader business connections, allowed for the expansion she had long envisioned. Within months, a small warehouse had been established in Bristol, significantly reducing the time and cost required to distribute her fabrics to distant markets. As her business continued its steady expansion, Evelina found herself increasingly recognized within broader trading circles, her reputation extending well beyond the small coastal town where she had first sought refuge from her broken engagement. Merchants who had once dealt exclusively with established textile houses in Manchester and Leeds began seeking her out directly, drawn by the consistent quality and fair pricing that had become the hallmark of her growing enterprise. Yet despite this growing success, Evelina remained careful to avoid drawing unnecessary attention to herself personally, preferring to let her business speak for itself rather than seeking recognition or celebrity for her accomplishments. She understood, perhaps more clearly than most in her position might have, how quickly public attention could turn from admiration to scrutiny, and how vulnerable a woman's reputation remained regardless of her professional success. You could easily become quite well known if you wished it, Margaret observed one evening, noting the growing volume of correspondence arriving from merchants and investors across the country. Your story alone would fascinate half of London society, I imagine, if it ever became widely known. I have no interest in becoming a curiosity for society's entertainment, Evelina replied firmly. Let the business speak for itself. I would rather be known for the quality of my fabric and the fairness of my dealings than for the scandal that first brought me to this town. As the seasons continued to turn, Evelina's enterprise grew steadily stronger, built on the same careful principles that had guided her from the very beginning. Fair treatment of workers, honest dealing with partners and customers, and a patient, methodical approach to growth that prioritized sustainability over rapid but unstable expansion. She had transformed not only a struggling mill into a thriving business, but had transformed herself in the process, from a woman defined entirely by her relationship to a man who had discarded her, into someone whose worth and success depended on no one but herself. She did not yet know how far this transformation would ultimately take her, nor did she fully anticipate the circumstances that would eventually bring her path crossing once again with the very people who had once cast her aside. But as she stood at the mill's entrance one crisp autumn morning, watching wagons loaded with fabric depart for the harbor where Captain Cross's vessel waited to carry her goods to markets far beyond anything she could have imagined during those dark days following her broken engagement, Evelina Ashworth allowed herself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she now possessed the strength and skill necessary to meet them entirely on her own terms. By the 3rd year of her marriage, Cordelia Whitmore Ravensmore had grown accustomed to a peculiar kind of loneliness, the sort that exists most painfully not in solitude, but in the presence of another person entirely indifferent to one's company. She and Alastair occupied the same grand house, attended the same social functions, and maintained the appearance of a successful ducal marriage before the watching eyes of society. Yet in private, they had become little more than strangers sharing a residence, bound together by a legal contract rather than any genuine affection or partnership. The estate's financial troubles, which Cordelia had worked so diligently to address during the early months of their marriage, had continued to resurface with troubling regularity. Alastair's gambling, which she had initially believed to be a minor indulgence common among gentlemen of his station, had grown into a habit that consumed increasingly significant sums from what remained of her original dowry. She discovered the true extent of his losses quite by accident, when a representative from one of London's more exclusive gaming establishments arrived at their estate unannounced, seeking payment for debts Alastair had accumulated over several months of increasingly reckless wagering. "His Grace assured us payment would be forthcoming weeks ago," the representative explained, clearly uncomfortable with the awkward position of demanding payment from a duke's household. "The amount owed has grown considerably, given the interest accrued during the delay." Cordelia reviewed the documents the man presented with a growing sense of horror, the figures far exceeding anything she had imagined possible. "This amount alone exceeds nearly a quarter of what remains in my personal accounts," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the anger building within her. "I regret the inconvenience, Your Grace," the representative replied, "but the establishment cannot continue extending credit indefinitely, regardless of His Grace's title." After settling the immediate debt using funds she had carefully set aside specifically for such emergencies, Cordelia confronted Alastair directly that evening, presenting him with the documentation of his losses with barely controlled fury. "You promised me, when we first discovered your father's hidden debts, that you would exercise greater caution regarding our finances," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "Instead, you have continued gambling away what remains of my dowry, as though it were an endless resource." Alastair, clearly embarrassed but unwilling to fully acknowledge the extent of his failure, attempted to deflect responsibility. "A gentleman is entitled to certain pursuits, Cordelia. You cannot expect me to abandon every pleasure simply because our finances require careful management." "Careful management," Cordelia repeated, her tone sharp with disbelief. "You call gambling away thousands of pounds careful management?" "Alastair, at this rate, my entire dowry will be consumed within a few short years, leaving us with nothing but the estate's existing debts and no resources whatsoever to address them." "You exaggerate the severity of the situation," Alastair replied, though his voice lacked genuine conviction. "I do not exaggerate," Cordelia said firmly. "I have reviewed the accounts myself, Alastair, something you clearly have not bothered to do in quite some time. Our income from the estate's tenants and holdings barely covers our regular expenses, let alone your gambling debts and the ongoing repairs still needed throughout the property. Without my dowry to bridge these gaps, we would already be facing genuine financial ruin." The argument that followed grew more heated than any previous disagreement between them, with years of accumulated frustration finally surfacing on both sides. Alastair, cornered by the undeniable truth of his own irresponsibility, resorted to wounded pride and deflection rather than genuine accountability. "Perhaps," he said coldly, "you regret marrying me now that you understand the true nature of our arrangement. Perhaps you wish you had remained unmarried, keeping your father's fortune entirely for yourself, rather than sharing it with a husband whose title you were so eager to acquire." The accusation stung, not because it held any truth, but because it revealed how little Alastair understood or cared about her genuine motivations and concerns. "I did not marry you for pleasure or affection, Alastair, as you well know. I married you believing, perhaps naively, that a partnership between us might eventually develop into something resembling mutual respect and shared purpose. Instead, I find myself managing an estate largely alone, while my husband gambles away our resources and blames me for daring to notice." Their argument ended, as most did without resolution, each retreating to separate wings of the house with the same unspoken tension that had come to define their daily existence. Cordelia lay awake that night considering her options, understanding with increasing clarity that she could no longer rely on Alastair to protect either the estate's future or her own personal security. The following morning, she wrote a lengthy letter to her father, describing the full extent of the situation with unusual candor. Charles Whitmore, upon receiving his daughter's letter, arrived at the estate within days, his expression grave as he reviewed the documentation Cordelia had carefully compiled regarding Alastair's mounting debts. "This is considerably worse than I feared," he said, setting down the papers with obvious concern. Cordelia, you cannot continue indefinitely covering these losses from your personal funds. At this rate, you will find yourself with nothing remaining, regardless of how carefully you manage the estate's legitimate expenses. I am aware of the danger, Father, Cordelia replied. But I do not know what alternative I possess. I am married to him, regardless of his failures. Society offers little sympathy or support for a duchess who complains publicly about her husband's shortcomings. Charles Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering the situation from every possible angle before responding. There may be alternatives you have not yet considered. Legal separations, while uncommon and certainly scandalous, are not entirely unheard of among the nobility when circumstances prove sufficiently dire. And even without formal separation, there exist methods of protecting your remaining resources from your husband's reckless spending, provided we act carefully and with proper legal guidance. What would you suggest? Cordelia asked, allowing herself to consider possibilities she had previously dismissed as impractical or scandalous. I would suggest, her father replied, that we consult with a discreet solicitor regarding establishing a trust for your remaining funds, one that Alastair cannot access without your explicit consent. This would not resolve the underlying tensions in your marriage, but it would at least ensure you retain some measure of financial security regardless of his continued recklessness. Over the following weeks, Cordelia worked quietly with a solicitor recommended by her father, a careful and discreet man named Oliver Hartley, to establish exactly such protections for her remaining resources. The process required considerable delicacy, given that Alastair's approval was legally required for certain aspects of the arrangement, but Charles Whitmore's own financial influence and connections proved sufficient to navigate the more challenging legal obstacles without arousing Alastair's suspicion regarding the full extent of the protections being established. You understand, Oliver Hartley explained during one of their private meetings, that this arrangement will not prevent His Grace from continuing to accumulate personal debts through gambling or other pursuits. It will simply ensure that your own resources remain protected from being consumed by such debts beyond what has already been lost. That is precisely the protection I require, Mr. Hartley, Cordelia replied. I no longer harbor any illusions about my husband's willingness to exercise financial restraint. My priority now is ensuring that whatever remains of my inheritance provides me with genuine security, regardless of what choices he continues to make regarding his own conduct. As these protective measures were quietly established, Cordelia's relationship with Alastair continued its slow but steady deterioration. He remained largely unaware of the full extent of the legal protections she had implemented, though he sensed, with growing resentment, that his wife had begun distancing herself from him in ways that extended well beyond their financial disagreements. You have grown cold toward me, he observed one evening, an unusual moment of vulnerability breaking through his typically defensive posture. I remember when we first married, you at least made an effort to maintain some semblance of warmth between us, even knowing our arrangement was primarily practical rather than romantic. I have grown tired, Alastair, not cold, Cordelia replied honestly. Tired of managing an estate alone while receiving nothing but resentment for my efforts. Tired of covering your gambling debts while you accuse me of caring more about money than partnership. I did make an effort in those early months to build something resembling genuine respect between us. You have shown me, repeatedly, that such respect holds little value for you compared to your own comfort and pride. Alastair had no adequate response to this accusation, though his expression suggested her words had affected him more than he was willing to openly acknowledge. Their marriage continued, outwardly at least, maintaining the appearance expected of their social position, while privately becoming an arrangement of careful distance and mutual disappointment rather than any genuine partnership. It was during this period of growing estrangement that occasional news of Evelina Ashworth's success finally began reaching London society, carried initially through vague rumors about a mysterious businesswoman operating a highly profitable textile enterprise somewhere along the southern coast. The rumors grew more specific over time, eventually confirming what a small number of well-connected merchants already knew, that the successful enterprise belonged to none other than the very woman Alastair had abandoned on their wedding day years earlier. Cordelia first heard these rumors during a social gathering hosted by one of her few remaining genuine friends among London's aristocracy, Lady Prudence Holt, a woman known for her sharp wit and genuine disinterest in the superficial gossip that typically dominated such events. "Have you heard the latest concerning your husband's former betrothed?" Lady Holt asked, her tone carrying more genuine curiosity than malicious gossip. "It seems the woman he so publicly discarded has built quite a successful business for herself, somewhere along the southern coast. Textile trade, if the rumors are accurate, though the details remain somewhat unclear." Cordelia felt a peculiar mixture of curiosity and unease upon hearing this news, uncertain how to process information about a woman she had never properly met, yet whose life had been irrevocably altered by her own marriage to Alastair. "I confess I know very little about the circumstances surrounding her departure from London, beyond the obvious scandal that accompanied it. From what I understand," Lady Holt continued, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share such intriguing gossip, "she left London with nothing but her father's small cottage and whatever remained after selling her jewelry. Yet somehow, within just a few years, she has built an enterprise substantial enough to attract attention from merchants across the country. Quite remarkable, really, for a woman who was so publicly humiliated." Cordelia said little in response to this information, though she found herself unable to entirely dismiss it from her thoughts in the days that followed. There was something in the story that resonated uncomfortably with her own circumstances, a recognition that both she and Evelina Ashworth had, in their own different ways, been forced to navigate the consequences of Alastair's choices and failures. Where Cordelia had chosen to remain within the confines of her marriage, working quietly to protect herself while maintaining outward appearances, Evelina had apparently chosen a different path entirely, rebuilding her life independently rather than remaining tied to circumstances beyond her control. As winter settled over London that year, bringing with it the usual round of holiday social obligations that Cordelia increasingly found exhausting rather than enjoyable, she found herself reflecting more frequently on the direction her own life had taken. She had entered her marriage with clear eyes, understanding exactly what she was sacrificing and what she hoped to gain in return. Instead of the partnership she had cautiously hoped might develop, she found herself managing a crumbling estate largely alone, protecting her remaining resources from a husband who viewed her fortune as an endless well rather than a finite resource requiring careful stewardship. The estate's financial troubles continued to worsen despite her best efforts, with Alastair's gambling debts accumulating faster than the careful improvements she had implemented could offset them. Percival Grimshaw, the estate's steward, brought increasingly concerning reports to her attention, warning that without significant changes, the estate risked genuine insolvency within just a few short years. "His Grace has taken additional loans against the estate's holdings," Grimshaw informed her one particularly difficult afternoon, his expression grave as he presented documentation she had not previously seen. "Loans secured through private arrangements rather than traditional banking institutions, at interest rates considerably less favorable than what might otherwise have been available." Cordelia reviewed the documents with growing alarm, recognizing immediately the danger such arrangements posed to the estate's already precarious finances. Does he understand the terms of these agreements? The interest alone, at these rates, will consume whatever income the estate generates within a matter of months. "I attempted to explain the risks to His Grace directly," Grimshaw admitted, "but he insisted the funds were necessary to address immediate obligations and dismissed my concerns regarding the long-term consequences." Cordelia closed her eyes briefly, gathering her composure before responding. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Mr. Grimshaw. I will need to review these agreements more thoroughly, before determining how best to proceed. That evening, alone in her private chambers, Cordelia allowed herself a rare moment of genuine despair. The accumulated weight of years spent managing a marriage and estate that seemed determined toward inevitable collapse finally threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She thought of her father's warnings before the marriage, warnings she had chosen to dismiss in favor of what she had believed might become a genuine partnership. She thought of the protections she had carefully established for her remaining resources, protections that now seemed increasingly insufficient given the scale of the estate's mounting obligations. And unexpectedly, she found her thoughts returning once again to the mysterious success of Evelina Ashworth, the woman whose life had been so dramatically altered by the same man now steering their shared estate toward financial ruin. Cordelia wondered, with a curiosity she could not entirely explain, what circumstances might eventually bring their paths to cross, and what she might learn from a woman who had somehow transformed public humiliation into genuine, independent success. She did not yet know that such a meeting would indeed occur, sooner than either woman might have anticipated, or that the circumstances bringing them together would prove far more significant than either could currently imagine. 5 years had passed since Evelina Ashworth first arrived at her father's neglected cottage by the sea, carrying nothing but a trunk of unwanted memories and a quiet determination to rebuild her shattered life. In that time, the small textile mill she had purchased with the remains of her jewelry had grown into something far beyond what even she had originally envisioned, evolving into a substantial trading company that now employed several hundred workers across multiple locations along the southern coast. The company, which she had modestly named Ashworth Trading after her father, had expanded well beyond simple fabric production. Under Evelina's careful guidance, it now encompassed dyeing operations. A small fleet of merchant vessels operated in partnership with Captain Nathaniel Cross, and direct trading relationships with merchants across England and increasingly into continental markets as well. The order from the merchant house in Amsterdam has been confirmed, Simon Fairweather reported during their regular morning meeting, reviewing correspondence that had arrived overnight. They wish to establish a standing arrangement for regular shipments, rather than the occasional orders we have filled for them previously. Excellent news, Evelina replied, making a note in the ledger she kept meticulously updated despite now employing a small staff of clerks who might have easily handled such record-keeping in her stead. She had never entirely relinquished her personal involvement in the company's finances, understanding from hard experience how easily control could slip away when left entirely in others' hands. Ensure our quality standards remain consistent regardless of increased volume. I would rather disappoint a demanding customer with limited quantity than damage our reputation through rushed, careless production. Understood, Simon replied, having long since internalized the principles that had guided the company's steady growth from its earliest days. Though I suspect we shall need to consider additional expansion soon, given the volume of orders now arriving regularly from multiple markets. The suggestion was not new. Evelina had been considering exactly such expansion for several months, weighing carefully the risks and benefits of establishing an additional production facility that might allow the company to meet growing demand without compromising the quality standards that had become central to its reputation. Lord Edmund Barrow, her silent partner whose initial investment had proven remarkably prescient given the company's subsequent growth, had recently suggested exactly such an expansion during their most recent correspondence. I believe the time has arrived to consider a second facility, Evelina said, setting down her pen to give the matter her full attention. Perhaps somewhere closer to Bristol, allowing us to reduce transportation costs while establishing a stronger presence in that market directly. A sensible consideration, Simon agreed. Though such expansion would require considerable additional capital, beyond what Lord Barrow's current investment provides. I have been corresponding with several potential investors, Evelina admitted, though I remain selective regarding who I allow into partnership with this company. I have built something valuable here, Simon, something that provides genuine security for its workers and genuine value for its customers. I have no wish to compromise those principles simply to accelerate growth beyond what careful management can properly sustain. This careful, principled approach to business had become something of a hallmark of Evelina's reputation throughout the trading circles in which Ashworth Trading now operated. Merchants who dealt with her company knew they could expect consistent quality and honest dealing, qualities that had proven increasingly valuable as her reputation spread beyond the initial region where the company had first taken root. Margaret Fenwick, who had remained Evelina's closest companion and confidant throughout the years of steady growth, often marveled at how thoroughly her friend had transformed since those difficult early days following her broken engagement. "You have built something remarkable here, Evelina," she observed one evening as they sat together reviewing the company's expanding correspondence, now arriving from merchants across 3 different countries. "I remember when you first suggested purchasing an interest in that struggling mill, and I confess I worried whether we had made a wise decision, given how little either of us understood about running a business at the time." "We learned as we proceeded," Evelina replied with a small smile, "which perhaps proved more valuable than if we had entered this venture with false confidence built on incomplete understanding. Every mistake taught us something useful. Every challenge forced us to develop skills we might never have discovered otherwise." Despite her considerable success, Evelina had maintained a deliberately modest personal lifestyle, choosing to reinvest the majority of the company's profits back into expansion and improved conditions for her workers, rather than accumulating personal luxury. She still lived in the same cottage her father had left her, though it had been considerably expanded and improved over the years to accommodate both her personal needs and the increasing volume of business correspondence and meetings that now regularly occurred there. This modesty had not gone unnoticed among the growing circle of merchants and businessmen with whom she now regularly interacted, many of whom found themselves genuinely impressed by a woman who had achieved such considerable success, while remaining remarkably unpretentious about her accomplishments. Lord Edmund Barrow, during one of his periodic visits to review the company's progress, remarked specifically on this quality during a conversation that touched briefly on matters beyond simple business affairs. "I have known many men who achieved far less than you have, Miss Ashworth, yet who behaved with considerably more arrogance regarding their accomplishments. Your continued humility, despite such remarkable success, speaks well of your character." "I have not forgotten what it feels like to lose everything through no fault of my own," Evelina replied honestly. "That experience taught me that success, however satisfying, remains fragile and should never be taken for granted or used as justification for treating others with less consideration than they deserve." Lord Barrow studied her for a moment with an expression she found difficult to interpret. "You speak, if I may say so, with the wisdom of someone who has experienced genuine hardship. I confess I have long wondered about the circumstances that first brought you to this coastal town, though I have never felt it appropriate to inquire directly." "Perhaps someday I will share that story," Evelina replied carefully, "though for now I prefer to focus on building the future rather than dwelling on the past that brought me here." Their conversation, though brief, hinted at a growing personal respect between them that extended beyond their business partnership, though Evelina remained cautious about allowing any romantic possibilities to develop, having learned hard lessons from her previous experience regarding trust and vulnerability. Lord Barrow, sensing her reluctance, respected these boundaries without pressing further, content to maintain their professional relationship while allowing whatever additional connection might exist to develop naturally, if at all, over time. As Ashworth Trading continued its expansion, Evelina found herself increasingly recognized as a significant figure within broader commercial circles, her success serving as inspiration for other women who might otherwise have never considered pursuing independent business ventures. She began receiving occasional correspondence from women across England, some seeking advice regarding their own modest business ambitions, others simply expressing admiration for what she had accomplished despite the considerable obstacles facing any woman attempting to succeed within a commercial world still dominated almost entirely by men. "You have become something of an inspiration," Margaret observed, noting the growing volume of such correspondence arriving alongside the company's regular business communications. "Perhaps you should consider responding more publicly to such interest, rather than simply answering each letter individually." "I have considered it," Evelina admitted, "though I remain uncertain whether drawing greater public attention to my story would ultimately prove beneficial or simply invite unwelcome scrutiny regarding circumstances I would prefer to keep private." This careful balance between growing public recognition and continued personal privacy became increasingly difficult to maintain as the company's reputation continued expanding. By the 5th year of operation, Ashworth Trading had established itself as one of the more significant textile trading enterprises along the southern coast, its products reaching markets that Evelina could scarcely have imagined during those early, uncertain days following her arrival at her father's neglected cottage. It was during this period of continued growth that Evelina first began hearing occasional rumors regarding the struggles facing the Ravensmore estate, information that reached her indirectly through business correspondence and casual conversation among merchants who maintained connections throughout London society. She listened to such rumors with a curious detachment, recognizing the name that had once caused her such profound pain, yet finding herself surprisingly unaffected by news of Alistair's continued financial difficulties. "They say the Duke's estate grows increasingly troubled," a visiting merchant mentioned during a business discussion that had briefly touched on unrelated London gossip. "Gambling debts, apparently, though the details remain somewhat unclear to those of us outside London society's inner circles." "How unfortunate," Evelina replied simply, genuinely surprised by how little emotional weight the information carried for her now, compared to how devastating such news might have affected her during those first difficult years following her broken engagement. She did not dwell further on the information, returning her attention instead to the ongoing expansion of her own successful enterprise, an enterprise built entirely on her own merit and determination rather than dependent on any man's approval or fortune. Yet the mention planted a small seed of curiosity that would occasionally resurface in quiet moments, a wondering about how differently her own life had unfolded compared to what she might have experienced had Alistair honored their original engagement. As autumn arrived once again along the southern coast, bringing with it the familiar rhythms of harvest and preparation for winter trade, Evelina found herself reflecting on the considerable distance she had traveled since that humiliating morning in London years earlier. She had transformed a moment of profound public humiliation into the foundation for genuine, independent success, building an enterprise that provided not only for her own security, but for the livelihoods of hundreds of workers who depended on her fair and thoughtful management. She did not yet know that circumstances were already beginning to align that would eventually bring her success into direct contact with the very man who had once discarded her so publicly. Nor could she have anticipated how thoroughly the power dynamics between them would have shifted by the time such a meeting finally occurred. For now, she simply continued her steady, methodical work, building an enterprise that answered to no one but herself, guided by principles that had proven both morally sound and remarkably profitable in equal measure. The company's growing success had begun attracting attention from an unexpected quarter as well, as Charles Whitmore, Cordelia's father, whose own extensive shipping interests occasionally intersected with the same markets Evelina's company now served, began hearing increasingly favorable reports regarding the quality and reliability of Ashworth Trading's textile products. Though he did not yet realize the personal connection between this successful businesswoman and his own daughter's troubled marriage, the seeds of a future meeting between their respective enterprises had already been quietly planted, waiting only for circumstances to bring them into direct alignment. The letter arrived at the Ravensmoor estate on an unusually cold morning in early spring, delivered alongside the usual collection of bills and creditor demands that had become an unwelcome but familiar part of Alastair's daily correspondence. Percival Grimshaw, reviewing the estate's mounting financial troubles with growing desperation, had spent weeks investigating potential solutions to what had become an increasingly dire situation, the estate now facing obligations that threatened its very survival. "I have identified a possible opportunity, Your Grace," Grimshaw explained, presenting the letter along with several accompanying documents. "A trading company along the southern coast has expressed interest in establishing a supply arrangement for fabric and textiles, one that could provide steady income sufficient to address at least a portion of our current obligations." Alastair reviewed the documents with the weary resignation that had become his default response to nearly every financial matter presented to him over the past several years. "Ashworth Trading," he read aloud, the name registering only vaguely, without any particular significance attached to it. "I am not familiar with this company." "Nor was I until recently," Grimshaw admitted. "But their reputation within trading circles has grown considerably over the past several years. Consistent quality, reliable delivery, and apparently quite favorable terms for establishing new business relationships. Given our current circumstances, I believe this represents one of our more promising options for generating additional income." "And what precisely would this arrangement require of us?" Alastair asked, his tone carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had grown weary of confronting his estate's continuing decline. "The company seeks distribution partners in London and surrounding areas," Grimshaw explained. "Given our estate's traditional connections throughout the region, we would be well positioned to facilitate such distribution, earning a commission on sales while requiring minimal additional investment beyond what we might already possess in terms of existing relationships and reputation." Alastair considered the proposal with more attention than he typically devoted to such matters, recognizing the desperate necessity of finding additional income given the estate's increasingly precarious financial position. "Arrange a meeting with the company's representatives," he instructed finally. "If this arrangement offers genuine potential for improving our circumstances, I am willing to consider it seriously." What Alastair did not yet know, and what Grimshaw himself had not discovered during his initial research into the company's background, was the true identity of the woman who had built Ashworth Trading from nothing into the substantial enterprise it had become. The correspondence establishing the initial meeting had been handled entirely by Simon Fairweather, who now managed much of the company's administrative correspondence, leaving Evelina's direct involvement unmentioned until circumstances required her personal presence. The meeting was arranged to take place at the Ravensmoor estate itself, given the substantial scale of the potential business arrangement being discussed. Evelina, upon learning the identity of the estate seeking partnership with her company, experienced a complicated mixture of emotions she had not anticipated feeling after so many years of successful independence. "Are you certain you wish to proceed with this meeting personally?" Margaret asked with obvious concern, having immediately recognized the significance of the estate's name once Simon mentioned it during their discussion of the proposed business arrangement. "You could easily send Simon or Lord Barrow in your stead, avoiding any direct confrontation with circumstances that clearly still hold some emotional weight, regardless of how far you have come since those difficult days." "I have built this company through my own direct involvement in every significant decision," Evelina replied, though her voice carried a slight hesitation that suggested the situation affected her more than she wished to openly acknowledge. "I will not begin avoiding important business matters now, simply because circumstances happen to involve people from my past." "And if seeing him again proves more difficult than you anticipate," Margaret pressed gently. Evelina was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Then I shall handle that difficulty as I have handled every other challenge these past several years, with the same careful composure and determination that brought me this far in the first place." The journey to London, a place Evelina had not visited since her humiliating departure years earlier, proved surprisingly less emotional than she had anticipated. Her attention focused primarily on preparing thoroughly for the business discussion ahead rather than dwelling on personal memories the journey inevitably stirred. Yet as the carriage finally approached the familiar grounds of the Ravensmore estate, she felt her composure tested more significantly than she had expected, memories of that final, humiliating morning returning with unexpected clarity. She arrived at the estate dressed in the practical but well-tailored attire that had become her professional standard, accompanied by Simon Fairweather, who would assist with the more technical aspects of the proposed business arrangement. As their carriage pulled into the estate's familiar courtyard, Evelina steadied herself with a deep breath, reminding herself of everything she had accomplished since last standing on these grounds. Alastair and Grimshaw awaited them in the estate's formal receiving room, the same room, Evelina noted with a private, ironic acknowledgement, where she had once spent countless hours managing the very estate accounts that now faced such considerable difficulty. Alastair's expression, upon her entrance, transformed through several distinct emotions in rapid succession, from polite professional greeting to genuine, undisguised shock as recognition finally settled over him. "Evelina," he said, her name escaping him almost involuntarily, the years having done little to diminish his immediate recognition of her presence. "Your Grace," Evelina replied, her voice carrying the calm professionalism she had carefully cultivated over years of business negotiations, giving no outward indication of the complicated emotions his stunned expression stirred within her. "I understand you are interested in discussing a potential business arrangement with Ashworth Trading." Alastair remained visibly shaken by her unexpected presence, requiring a moment to fully compose himself before responding. I had no idea. Grimshaw did not mention that Ashworth Trading was connected to you in any way." "I own the company, Your Grace," Evelina replied simply. "I have owned it and personally managed its growth for the past several years." Grimshaw, sensing the considerable tension that had suddenly filled the room, attempted to redirect the conversation toward more practical matters. "Perhaps we should proceed with reviewing the specific terms of the proposed arrangement, given the considerable distance Miss Ashworth has traveled for this discussion." The subsequent negotiation proved a study in careful professionalism on Evelina's part, as she methodically presented the terms under which her company would consider establishing the distribution partnership Alastair's estate had proposed. Her knowledge of trade agreements, her clear understanding of profit margins and distribution logistics, and her overall command of every aspect of the proposed arrangement left little room for Alastair to question her competence, despite whatever personal history complicated their professional interaction. "You have built something remarkable," Alastair said at one point, unable to entirely suppress his genuine admiration despite the awkward circumstances of their reunion. "I confess I never imagined when we last parted that you would achieve such considerable success." "You gave me little reason to believe you thought of my future prospects at all when we last parted," Evelina replied evenly, though without any particular bitterness in her tone, simply stating the facts of their shared history as plainly as she might discuss any straightforward business matter. "I built this success through my own efforts, using resources I gathered entirely independent of any expectation regarding your continued involvement in my life." The comment, though delivered without visible anger, clearly affected Alastair, who seemed to visibly absorb the full weight of everything he had discarded on that humiliating morning years earlier. "I have often wondered," he said quietly, "whether my decisions that day were entirely wise, given everything that has transpired since." "Wondering, Your Grace, changes little regarding decisions already made and consequences already experienced," Evelina replied. "I am here today to discuss a business arrangement that might benefit both our respective enterprises, not to revisit choices from years past that neither of us can alter regardless of how we might feel about them now." Her composed, professional response effectively redirected the conversation back toward practical matters, though the underlying tension remained palpable throughout the remainder of their discussion. Grimshaw, clearly relieved by Evelina's willingness to maintain focus on the business arrangement despite the complicated personal history involved, worked diligently to finalize terms that would prove beneficial for both parties. By the conclusion of their meeting, a preliminary agreement had been established, one that would allow the Ravensmore estate to serve as a primary distribution partner for Ashworth Trading's products throughout London and the surrounding region, providing much-needed income for the struggling estate, while further expanding Evelina's already substantial market reach. As the meeting concluded and preparations began for Evelina's departure, Alastair found a moment to speak with her privately, away from Grimshaw and Simon's presence. "I owe you an apology, Evelina, one considerably overdue given everything that has transpired between us." "You owe me nothing, Your Grace," Evelina replied, though her tone carried a complexity that suggested the matter remained more nuanced than her simple words conveyed. "Whatever pain your decision caused me years ago ultimately led me toward a life and a success I would never have discovered otherwise. In a strange way, I have come to view that difficult morning as the beginning of something far more valuable than what I lost." "You are more gracious than I deserve," Alastair admitted, genuine humility evident in his expression for perhaps the first time since she had known him. "Grace requires little effort, Your Grace, when one has built a life that no longer depends on someone else's approval or affection," Evelina replied. "I wish you well in resolving your estate's difficulties, and I look forward to a productive business partnership between our respective enterprises. Beyond that, I believe we have little more to discuss regarding matters better left in the past." With that, she took her leave, climbing into her waiting carriage with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout their entire encounter. As the carriage pulled away from the estate that had once been meant to become her home, Evelina allowed herself a moment of genuine reflection, recognizing the profound transformation she had undergone since last departing these same grounds in humiliation and heartbreak. She was no longer the devastated bride whose future had depended entirely on a man's fickle affections. She had become a woman whose success and security depended on no one but herself, a transformation that made this difficult reunion far more manageable than she might have anticipated during those darker days years earlier. Whatever remained of her old feelings toward Alastair had been replaced by something far more valuable, genuine, independent strength that no betrayal could ever again diminish. Behind her, in the grand but increasingly troubled halls of the Ravensmore estate, Alastair remained standing long after her carriage had disappeared from view, finally confronting the full weight of everything he had sacrificed in pursuit of what he had once believed would solve all his problems. The woman he had discarded for a fortune had built something far more valuable than any dowry could have provided, while his own marriage, entered specifically to avoid the very ruin he now faced regardless, continued its steady, inevitable decline. The partnership between Ashworth Trading and the Ravensmore estate proceeded successfully over the following months, providing exactly the steady income Grimshaw had hoped might help address the estate's most pressing obligations. Yet even as this business arrangement brought modest financial relief, the deeper troubles within the Ravensmore household continued their inevitable progression toward crisis. Cordelia, who had grown increasingly distant from Alastair over the preceding years, learned of the new business partnership through Grimshaw's routine reports regarding the estate's improving income, though she remained unaware for some time of the personal history connecting her husband to the woman now supplying much of their distribution income. It was during a chance conversation with Lady Prudence Holt, whose sources within London's gossip networks remained as reliable as ever, that Cordelia finally learned the full truth. "I understand your husband has established a business arrangement with none other than his former betrothed," Lady Holt mentioned during one of their regular social visits, watching Cordelia's reaction carefully. "The very woman he abandoned on their wedding day, now providing the income that keeps your estate from complete financial collapse. Rather remarkable when you consider the circumstances." Cordelia absorbed this information with a complicated mixture of emotions, surprise mingling with a strange sense of validation regarding suspicions she had long harbored about the fundamental instability of her marriage. She confronted Alistair that same evening, demanding a full explanation regarding the business arrangement's true origins. "You might have mentioned," she said, her voice carrying more exhaustion than genuine anger at this point, years of accumulated disappointment, having largely depleted her capacity for surprise regarding her husband's continued failures of judgment and communication. "That the trading company saving our estate from immediate ruin belongs to the very woman you discarded to marry me." Alistair, cornered by the truth he had clearly hoped to keep private, offered little genuine defense. "I did not see how the information would benefit our discussion regarding the business arrangement itself. The partnership serves our interests regardless of its owner's identity." "That is not the point, Alistair," Cordelia replied, finally allowing years of accumulated frustration to surface fully. "The point is that you continue treating me as though I require protection from information rather than partnership in managing our shared circumstances. You did this when you hid your father's true debts before our marriage. You did this when you continued gambling despite my repeated warnings. And now, you do this regarding a business arrangement that clearly carries significant personal history for you, information I discovered not from you directly, but from society gossip." Alistair had no adequate response to this accusation, the pattern Cordelia identified proving impossible to genuinely deny. Their conversation that evening marked a turning point in their already troubled marriage, with Cordelia finally articulating conclusions she had been quietly forming for years. "I have protected my remaining resources as best I could, Alistair, understanding that you would never provide the partnership or consideration I once hoped our marriage might include," she said, her voice steady despite the significance of what she was about to say. "I believe the time has arrived for us to consider a formal separation, one that allows us both to pursue our respective futures without continuing to inflict the particular misery we have created for each other these past several years." Alistair, though visibly startled by the directness of her proposal, found himself unable to genuinely argue against her reasoning. Their marriage had long since become a source of mutual disappointment rather than any genuine partnership, and the financial protections Cordelia had carefully established years earlier meant that a separation would not leave her entirely dependent on whatever remained of the estate's uncertain future. The subsequent legal separation, arranged discreetly with the assistance of Oliver Hartley and Charles Whitmore's considerable influence, proceeded with far less scandal than either party might have anticipated, society's attention having largely moved on to fresher gossip by the time the arrangement became public knowledge. Cordelia retreated to her father's estate, where she began, for the first time since her marriage, exploring genuine independence, eventually applying her own considerable business acumen toward managing a portion of her father's shipping interests directly. Meanwhile, Evelina's success continued its steady, remarkable expansion. Ashworth Trading now recognized as one of the most significant and respected textile enterprises operating throughout England, and increasingly into continental European markets. Her reputation for fair dealing and consistent quality had established her as a genuine authority within commercial circles that had once been almost entirely closed to women pursuing independent business ambitions. It was during this period of continued success that Evelina and Cordelia's paths finally crossed directly, a meeting arranged not through any deliberate design, but through the natural intersection of their respective business interests as Cordelia began establishing her own trading ventures using her father's extensive shipping connections. Their initial meeting, arranged to discuss a potential partnership between Ashworth Trading and the shipping interests Cordelia now managed, carried an inherent awkwardness given their shared, complicated history with Alistair. Yet both women approached the encounter with the same careful professionalism that had come to define their respective business successes, focusing deliberately on practical matters rather than allowing personal history to interfere with legitimate commercial opportunity. "I confess," Cordelia said during a private moment following their initial business discussion. "I have long wondered what circumstances might arise if we ever found ourselves in direct contact, given everything that connects our respective histories." "I harbor no particular animosity toward you, Lady Ravensmore," Evelina replied honestly. "Whatever happened between myself and Alistair occurred entirely through his own choices, not through any deception or malice on your part. You were, in many ways, as much a victim of his poor judgment as I was, simply in a different manner." Cordelia found herself genuinely moved by this response, having long assumed that any interaction with Evelina would carry significant tension or resentment given their shared connection to Alistair's failures. "That is more generous than I likely deserve, given that I ultimately married the man who caused you such public humiliation. You made a reasonable decision, based on the information available to you at the time," Evelina replied. "None of us can be blamed entirely for decisions made without full knowledge of circumstances that would only reveal themselves later. What matters now, I believe, is what we each choose to build going forward, rather than dwelling on choices we cannot alter." Their subsequent business partnership, established on the foundation of this surprisingly candid initial conversation, proved remarkably successful, combining Evelina's manufacturing expertise with Cordelia's shipping connections to create trading opportunities that benefited both women considerably. Over time, their professional relationship developed into something resembling genuine friendship, an unlikely but meaningful connection built on shared experience and mutual respect, rather than any lingering resentment regarding their complicated shared history. Alistair, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated as both women whose lives he had significantly affected moved forward successfully without him, their independent achievements standing in stark contrast to his own continued struggles, managing an estate that never fully recovered from years of financial mismanagement. The business partnership with Ashworth Trading, while providing some relief, proved insufficient to address the estate's deeper structural problems that Alistair, even now, struggled to address with the diligence and attention such circumstances genuinely required. He occasionally attended social functions where he would encounter news of Evelina's continued success, or witness Cordelia's own growing reputation as a capable businesswoman, managing her father's shipping interests with evident skill. These encounters, though never directly confrontational, served as constant, uncomfortable reminders of choices he had made years earlier, choices that had ultimately cost him more than he had ever anticipated when he first believed marrying for fortune rather than genuine partnership would solve his estate's troubles. "It is a peculiar thing," Margaret observed one evening, sitting with Evelina in the now considerably expanded and comfortable cottage that remained Evelina's chosen home, despite her substantial wealth and the grander residences now well within her means. "To watch someone who once held such power over your happiness gradually diminish while you continue to rise. Do you feel any satisfaction in it?" Evelina considered the question carefully before responding, as she had learned to consider most significant questions throughout her years of building genuine success from the wreckage of public humiliation. "I feel less satisfaction than you might expect, Margaret. I do not take pleasure in his continued struggles, precisely, though I cannot deny a certain quiet vindication in recognizing that my own worth was never dependent on his approval or affection, as he seemed to believe when he discarded me so publicly." "What do you feel, then, if not satisfaction?" "Gratitude mostly," Evelina replied after a thoughtful pause. "Gratitude that his betrayal, however painful at the time, ultimately freed me to build a life entirely my own, rather than remaining forever dependent on someone else's continued regard for my happiness and security. I would not trade this life, built through my own effort and determination, for the marriage I once believed I wanted so desperately." As the years continued to pass, Ashworth Trading grew into one of the most respected and successful commercial enterprises in England, its founder recognized not merely as a curious exception to society's expectations regarding women in business, but as a genuine authority whose judgment and expertise commanded respect throughout commercial circles. Cordelia, meanwhile, established her own considerable reputation, managing significant portions of her father's shipping empire, eventually expanding into ventures entirely her own, built on the same principles of careful, honest dealing that had guided Evelina's remarkable rise. Alistair, by contrast, continued his slow decline, the Ravensmore estate never fully recovering from years of mismanagement and reckless spending, its former grandeur gradually fading into a shadow of what it had once represented. He remained, in the years that followed, a cautionary figure within society's collective memory, a duke who had discarded genuine loyalty for fortune, only to watch both women his choices had effected rise to heights he himself would never achieve. And Evelina, standing at the entrance to the mill that had grown from a single struggling building into the foundation of a substantial commercial empire, would occasionally reflect on the profound distance she had traveled since that humiliating morning years earlier. She had transformed public heartbreak into private strength, betrayal into independence, and humiliation into a success that answered to no one but herself. The Duke who had once held such power over her happiness now watched, from an increasingly diminished position, as the woman he had forsaken rose steadily above him, her success built not on inherited privilege or fortunate circumstance, but on her own considerable talent, determination, and unwavering integrity. She had in the end built something far more valuable than any title or dowry could have provided. A life entirely her own, secured through her own effort, answering to her own judgment, and standing as proof that genuine worth depends not on another person's approval, but on the quiet, persistent determination to rebuild, no matter how thoroughly one's world might first fall apart. 10 years after that humiliating morning in London, the name Ashworth Trading had become synonymous with quality and integrity throughout the textile markets of England and much of Western Europe. Evelina, now approaching her 40th year, had built something that extended well beyond mere commercial success, establishing training programs for young workers, fair pension arrangements for those who had served the company faithfully for years, and a reputation for ethical business practice that other enterprises increasingly sought to emulate. The estate that had once belonged to the Ravensmore family finally passed from Alistair's hands during this same period, sold to settle debts that had grown far beyond what even a lifetime of careful management could have resolved. Alistair himself relocated to a considerably smaller property, inherited through a distant relative, his once proud title now carrying little of the influence or respect it had commanded during his younger years. He lived quietly, largely removed from the society circles that had once celebrated his marriage to Cordelia Whitmore as one of the finest matches of the season. Cordelia, meanwhile, had fully established herself as one of the most capable shipping magnates in England, her father's empire having grown substantially under her direct management following Charles Whitmore's eventual retirement. She never remarried, choosing instead to dedicate her considerable energy and skill toward building an enterprise that provided her with genuine independence and purpose, free from the disappointments that had characterized her earlier marriage. The friendship between Cordelia and Evelina, forged initially through practical business necessity, deepened considerably over the following years into a genuine and mutually supportive relationship. The two women, who might easily have remained bitter rivals or distant strangers given their shared connection to Alistair's failures, instead discovered in each other a rare understanding of what it meant to rebuild a life from the wreckage of misplaced trust. "We built something neither of us could have imagined during those difficult early years," Cordelia observed during one of their regular visits, now a comfortable tradition between the two successful businesswomen. "I confess, when I first learned of your connection to Alistair, I expected to feel resentment or discomfort in your presence. Instead, I found someone who understood, perhaps better than anyone else, exactly what it meant to rebuild dignity and purpose after being treated as though one's worth depended entirely on a man's convenience." "We have both proven, I believe," Evelina replied, "that genuine worth depends on nothing beyond one's own character and determination. Neither title nor fortune, nor a husband's approval ultimately defines what we are capable of achieving, when given the opportunity and the courage to pursue it independently. Evelina's personal life, though she had remained deliberately private regarding matters beyond her business affairs, eventually included a quiet and genuine partnership with Lord Edmund Barrow, whose respect for her independence and accomplishments had gradually deepened into a mutual affection built on genuine equality, rather than the transactional arrangements that had characterized so many marriages within their society. They married eventually, though Evelina insisted on maintaining full control over Ashworth trading regardless of her marital status, a condition Lord Barrow readily accepted, having long admired precisely the independent strength that had made her success possible in the first place. "I have no wish to diminish what you have built through your own remarkable effort," he told her during their modest, private wedding ceremony, attended by only their closest associates, rather than the grand society gathering that might have once accompanied such a union. "I married you for exactly the woman you have become, not for any illusion of control over your considerable accomplishments." Their partnership proved a genuine collaboration rather than the hierarchical arrangement that had characterized Evelina's earlier engagement, with Lord Barrow contributing his own business expertise, while fully respecting her ultimate authority over the enterprise she had built from nothing. Together, they continued expanding Ashworth Trading's reach, eventually establishing trading relationships that extended across the Atlantic to the growing markets of the American colonies, further cementing the company's position as one of the most significant commercial enterprises of its era. Margaret Fenwick, who had remained a constant and beloved presence throughout Evelina's remarkable journey, eventually established her own small but successful venture, a school dedicated to teaching young women practical skills in business management and accounting, skills that had proven so valuable during Evelina's own early struggles to understand the mill's complicated finances. The school, funded partially through Evelina's continued generosity, provided opportunities for other women to pursue the kind of independent success that had once seemed impossible for someone in their position. "We are creating something that extends well beyond our own individual success," Margaret observed as she oversaw the school's growing enrollment of eager young women determined to master skills their society had long insisted belonged exclusively to men. "Perhaps someday, women pursuing business ambitions will no longer be viewed as unusual curiosities, but simply as capable individuals pursuing legitimate opportunities, regardless of their gender." "That would be a fitting legacy," Evelina agreed, "far more meaningful than any personal fortune or title I might have accumulated along the way." As Evelina entered her later years, having built an enterprise that would continue providing for hundreds of workers and their families long after her own eventual passing, she occasionally reflected on the profound irony of her journey. The humiliation that had once seemed like the ending of everything she valued had instead become the beginning of a life far richer and more meaningful than the one she had originally envisioned for herself as a young bride waiting anxiously for a duke's attention and approval. She had learned, through years of difficult but ultimately rewarding experience, that genuine security depends not on another person's continued affection or approval, but on one's own capacity for resilience, determination, and honest, principled effort. The Duke who had once discarded her so publicly had, in the end, lost far more than he had gained through his calculated pursuit of fortune, while Evelina had gained far more than she had lost through her own quiet, persistent rebuilding. In her final years, Evelina often spoke to the young women who sought her guidance regarding their own business ambitions, sharing not the specific details of her painful past, which she continued to guard as a private matter between herself and those who had shared that difficult period alongside her, but the broader lessons she had learned throughout her remarkable journey. "Whatever circumstances life presents you," she would tell them, "remember that your worth does not depend on someone else's recognition of it. Build something that belongs entirely to you, something that no one else's choices or betrayals can ever take away." That security, once genuinely established, proves far more valuable than any fortune or title bestowed by another person's temporary favor. Ashworth Trading continued its successful operation for generations following Evelina's eventual passing, having been carefully structured to ensure its founding principles of fair treatment and honest dealing would continue guiding its operations regardless of who eventually assumed leadership. The company's history, and the remarkable story of the woman who had built it from the wreckage of public humiliation, became something of a legend within commercial circles, inspiring generations of women who followed in pursuing their own independent ambitions, despite whatever obstacles society might place before them. And though Alastair Ravensmore's own story faded gradually into obscurity, remembered mainly as a cautionary tale regarding the fleeting value of fortune pursued without genuine partnership or integrity, Evelina Ashworth's legacy endured, a testament to the enduring truth that genuine strength and worth are built not through another's favor, but through one's own patient, principled determination to rise above whatever circumstances first threaten to define us.